Hello and welcome to Unspun Live, the politics podcast from the Herald. My name is Andrew Learmonth. I'm the political editor of the Herald, and I'm joined by Kathleen Nutt, political correspondent with the paper. And today's episode is all about Jamie Greene, the former Tory MSP, who is now the new Liberal Democrat MSP, their fifth MSP. So they're now a group in Holyrood rather than just a bunch of MSPs. Now, if you talk to the Tories, they say that Jamie was always he was never going to be selected again, that his local party never liked him, that he was probably, they were sort of moving to, he would never have been high enough on the list to get in at the next election. So they see this as, or they suggest that this is more just, he jumped before he was pushed. This is a bid to get a seat for the next election. Do you get that impression?
Well,
do you think this is
I'm not sure. I mean, I don't. I actually, having spoken to him for a good half an hour, asked him lots of very detailed questions, I didn't really get that sense that he was just doing it because he didn't think he was going to get back in to Holyrood in 2026, standing as a Conservative. And in fact, he actually said he didn't even know whether he was going to want to stand again or whether he was going to take some time out from politics and not stand in 2026 as a Lib Dem candidate. He said that's something he was still thinking about. So I didn't get the impression he was just doing it as a career opportunity, really.
Perhaps more widely then, what does his defection say about the state of the Scottish Tories at the moment?
Well, the interesting point was I asked him what the reaction was among his party colleagues, and clearly there were some who were extremely annoyed and told him so very directly. But there were some who actually, he said, were pretty sympathetic to his decision, which I was quite surprised by. He said there were some colleagues who spoke privately to him who actually agreed with his analysis of the party and agreed that it was going too much to the right in order to try and limit the reform vote. And I suppose, speaking to him, it made me think that the Conservatives, there is a dilemma that they face at the moment. If they move too far to the right to try and stop reform, then the problem is they will lose support among more moderate Conservatives, like, for example, Jamie Greene, and there are probably other more moderate Conservatives out there. Another problem I think that there is for the Conservatives is if they do try and embrace a sort of more reform agenda, like, for example, anti-immigration, anti-Europe. I mean, is that going to be a successful strategy given there is a reform party out there that
can you out-reform reform?
Yes, can you out-reform reform? If you're a voter who is inclined to share the ideas of reform, are you really going to back a sort of more reform light version of it in the Conservatives, or are we just not going to vote for reform? It's a dilemma for them.
I think this is going to be one of the big stories of the next year as we move towards the Holyrood elections, and of course we've got the local elections in England this week as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But without further ado, let's go into the interview. Here is Kathleen speaking to Jamie Greene in the Scottish Parliament last week.
It's been a funny week. I won't lie, I was extremely nervous about coming back to Parliament after the Easter recess.
Yes.
I mean, all of this kicked off in the days before we broke for recess. And I hadn't really seen or spoken to anyone during that period other than electronically text messages and phone calls. So it was the first time I was going to bump into people in the corridor, first time I was going to sit in the chamber. But, I came in on Tuesday and decided to get straight stuck into it. So there was a topical question on Tuesday about ferry infrastructure in the west coast of Scotland, perfect opportunity to get back to the day job. And I pressed my button and thought, well, I'm here now. Let's get stuck in.
Yes.
And I asked a question about Ardrossan Harbour because that's important to my constituents.
Yes.
And I felt like that was the best way to approach this. I was there yesterday in the chamber and I was there today for FMQs as well. You can't hide away from decisions you've made. You have to own them. You have to face up to people that maybe disagree with those decisions. And you have to move on. I'm trying to very much look forward rather than backwards in my political journey.
And in terms of the responses from both parties, from both your former colleagues in the Conservatives and from your new colleagues in the Lib Dems, how has it been? I mean, experienced any, say, distrust from the Lib Dems, and how have your former colleagues in the Conservatives responded?
We'll do them in reverse order. So, I mean, the defections don't happen very often in Holyrood. So I think when they do, it's it was perhaps bigger news than I expected it to be. To be quite honest, I mean, for me, it's been a much easier decision than how perhaps others perceived it. I absolutely understand that people that I've worked with and shared office space with, and shared many ups and downs with over the years, colleagues and indeed friends, and I do consider many of my former colleagues in the Conservative Party as good friends of mine, and there's still a lot of mutual, I hope, respect and decency there in those relationships. I always knew that would be put to the test by doing this. I didn't underestimate how difficult a move it would be, but also the effect it would have on them as well. In the very early hours and days of it, I think there's a bit of shock, certainly some anger, certainly some disappointment. But equally, I also had an awful lot of positive messages from people saying, "I absolutely respect and understand your decision."
From within the Conservatives,
Yeah. And not just MSP colleagues. Over those days after I resigned, the whip, my email box, my social media inboxes started to fill up with messages from people that I've known for a decade in politics, and many of them are Conservative voters, activists, party members. Of course, some of them were extremely unhappy and sent, extremely unpleasant messages. However, I would say the majority of contact I've had from Conservative activists and members has been okay. A lot of people empathise with what I had to say in my resignation letter. I think some, perhaps even MSP colleagues, perhaps agree with much of it, but wouldn't say so publicly. And I understand that.
Does anybody say that to you, that they agreed? I mean, privately they were saying that, clearly. How many were saying that?
A couple, to different degrees of agreement. Some people, almost to the word said, if I was going to write a letter, that's what I would have written. Perhaps for different reasons, but my analysis of the party, I think, rang true, and rang home to some people. Others said, look, I wouldn't have gone about it that way, but I absolutely understand where you're coming from, and there's little to disagree in some of your arguments about the direction of travel of the party. I stand by every word that was in the letter. It was a carefully constructed resignation letter. It made the points that I felt I had to. It talked about, the whole first page was about the history of the journey of the party over the last 10 years and the many positives that have come out of that. A lot of the goodness that existed and still exists in the party, a lot of the good people and the good ideas that were there. And I think that sense of, we were all in it together with a shared ambition, and the party had changed so much. The Scottish Tories were in a place where they'd overtaken Labour into pole position as the main opposition party. That was unthinkable 15, 20 years ago. It was a real shock to the political scene. And I reflect on that. And I think that is important. I then reflect a little bit in my resignation about some of the things that I've been doing over the last 9 years and some of the values that got me into politics in the first place, and the fact that none of that's changed. But then, of course, the crunch comes towards the end of the letter, where I made my analysis of where the party is going and why I could not continue to sign up to it.
You said it was a reform-light agenda that they were heading.
Those are the phrases that were plucked out, I think, because they were perhaps the more headline-grabbing. But if you look amongst that, there's also much more meaty content in terms of specifics about where I think they have a problem. And that's a wider direction of travel for a political party that started off as a pro-union, fairly moderate centrist with progressive views, and the broad church, to use the cliches, has accelerated and deteriorated into a party chasing after votes on the further right of the spectrum, which therefore altered its narrative. And its policy making and the way it said things and what it said had changed so much in the last year, particularly since its new leader took over.
And what about the reaction among the Lib Dems? Clearly they're delighted to have you. It bumps up their numbers, and they've got now a parliamentary group. But at the same time, has there been any sort of level of distrust? Here you were a Conservative for almost 10 years, and now you're a Lib Dem. We think,
I really was
what's that
expecting
about?
a bit of that. You know, I
Mhm.
think human nature is trepidation that you're going to walk into a group of people who've really been, you know, I won't use the word, but working their bums off for a long time to get to where they are,
Yes.
and going through these experiences together through thick and thin,
Mhm.
and then somebody just turns up on the doorstep.
Mhm.
Of course, I was nervous.
Mhm.
I'm being honest when I say I haven't had a single negative word from a single party member, voter, activist, elected representative, staff member. And I don't think they were just given a memo to say, just be nice to Jamie. But honestly, it's chalk and cheese.
Yes. Yeah.
The atmosphere, the buzz, the feeling. I genuinely think, both for myself and my staff members, we've never been so happy. You know, I really feel like a weight's been lifted off my shoulder, and I'm suddenly enthusiastic and buoyed and brimming with ideas about what I can do in the next 12 months before the end of the session.
Can you talk me through the process of when you came to decide that you were going to leave the Conservatives? It was a long process. I think you suggested in your letter that it was a process that had been happening for some time.
Yeah.
What were the sort of the crunch points that made you move towards, or leave the Conservatives? And was there one particular thing that sparked it really?
Yeah, I mean, it's a growing sense of unease, and that can be social media content. It could be motions for debates. It could be press releases or comments that are made by spokespeople or the party leader. It's a number of things that you feel increasingly uncomfortable with. Now, actually, it was actually someone else that commented that on a number of very key debates where the Conservatives were leading the agenda or the discussion, they'd always commented, "Oh, I noticed you weren't in the chamber for that debate."
Right. Yes.
Or I noticed you didn't vote on that particular motion. And I realized that was so true. The frequency had reduced. The amount of time between not being in the chamber and skipping class, if you like.
Particular things?
Yeah, there were a couple. So, for example, I was very unhappy with the motion about the removal of bus passes for asylum seekers. I understood the logic behind some of the arguments, and I was sympathetic to the idea of how we best use public money. But what it was doing in my head was pitching one vulnerable group of society, in that case, refugees and migrants, against old people who were struggling to pay their heating bills. Two unrelated things, by the way. And it was a party decision was made to lump those two together and say, well, we'll rob Peter to pay Paul. And what that does is pit one vulnerable group of people against another.
Yes.
And I've never been happy with that narrative. That was the first one.
Yes.
There, of course, were future debates where, of course, the issue of gender had been coming up, and there were some debates on that I managed to, what we call pair, in other words, agree with the government that I wouldn't vote, and they wouldn't vote on the other side, so the numbers
Which
even
one
up.
particular?
I'm trying to remember.
Yeah.
But
that was clearly that you were completely out of step with the Conservatives on that
just
issue,
the narrative
and very much a sort of good fit for the Lib Dems.
Well, not really.
On gender issues.
That particular bill was passed by a majority and actually had support from all political parties. So it wasn't a reason to go particularly to the Liberal Democrats.
Yes, that wasn't. Yeah.
But I think the Liberal Democrats are people that I've had worked with over the many years that I've been here on a number of pieces of legislation. I've had a number of portfolios of justice, education, transport and infrastructure, connectivity. I've sat in numerous committees with colleagues and worked together on various things over the years, and always, found some much common ground. I always had certainly more in common than not across the chamber anyway. So that in itself made life a bit easier.
Yes.
But I really felt like the Liberal Democrat Party in Scotland now much more reflects the party that I originally joined back in 2016, which was the new, if you like, Scottish Conservatives under Ruth Davidson. And that party's gone, to be quite honest with you. Now, some of the people that joined me on that journey are still in the party. I don't know how comfortable they are with the current direction of travel of the Conservatives. I know I get the impression, feeling that many of them aren't. The same be true of their activist base, and certainly the same be true of voters.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because John Swinney, when he looked over at the Conservative benches, said that he thought, in his view, there were quite a number who were unhappy, and seems to suggest that there might be more defections.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Don't get me wrong, you look up the SNP backbenches, he's got a few problems there himself. I saw a couple of folk waving at him from the back there, which is interesting, actually. I mean, you go hark back to the days when Nicola Sturgeon was in charge, and it was a tight ship in the SNP. The idea that someone would rebel against the front bench was unheard of. You've seen it more and more frequently in the Scottish government. Hamza Yousaf, I think, started it, and poor John Swinney's had to inherit that a sense of unease. So, I mean, every political party will have a spectrum, I understand that. And I certainly felt, I'd made no apologies for being on the more centrist end of the Conservative spectrum. But that was fine because I was made to feel welcome and that your views mattered and you were included. But you can't sit there listening to a narrative time after time thinking at some point in the next year, we're going to have to write a manifesto and we're all going to have to sign up to it and be re-elected on that manifesto. And I knew in my heart of hearts that's not something I could do. The question is whether the 30 remaining MSPs on the Conservative benches, in their heart of hearts, can sit there day after day and listen to that narrative and feel comfortable with it and put up with it and then put their names to it in a manifesto and stand for re-election under that banner. That's a personal choice for them.
Do you think there will be any more defections, say, to the Liberal Democrats, or could there be defections to Reform?
Look, I haven't done any hard sell to any of my former colleagues or from any party. I've just simply said people need to do what they think's right in their conscience. People need to do what they think's right in their heart of hearts. I knew myself, and I know now, in the last few weeks have vindicated that for me, that I know I made the right decision, and I know it was tough. And I know there's consequences to it. And the same people watching how this has played out, having seen what it's like, would it put them off doing it themselves? Who knows? I'd like to say to them though, it doesn't have to be like that. There's people that will help. If you want to get out, come and talk to me. My door's open.
Going back a little bit to the process of you sort of point out with the Conservatives. I know that it was a fairly gradual process, but was there one particular thing you thought that's the trigger point? That's the time that I'm really going to go now.
Yeah, I mean, so without sort of labouring the point too much, it was the last week before the Easter recess. We had the motion of condolence for our former colleague Christina McKelvie, who I did a lot of work with over the years. In fact, a photo popped up on my phone the other day, and it was a trip we'd all made to Brussels when we were sat in the Qualities Committee together. And there were happier times. There was Mary Fee in the photo from Labour, myself, a Tory at the time, Christina SNP, and Alex from the Liberal Democrats. Real cross-party effort, all there with the same kind of ideas. We want to improve people's lives. We all have our different views in the Constitution, but we really want to make our fellow Scots' lives a little bit better from an equalities point of view. And that was a shared common interest there. And because of that, I really, we got on really well. When things were tough, and things had been tough over the last couple of years, she'd always sort of come up and put her arms around you. And it really meant a lot to me. And I think it really hit us quite hard. When I had to do that, I was very lucky to be able to do a small contribution in the motion of condolence.
Yes, yeah.
And I was really grateful for that. And I was very grateful to the Conservative whips for letting me speak, because we didn't have to have an extra speaker, but, and I publicly thank them for it. But I thought long and hard about what I was going to say. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt I had to be true to myself and what I said. And I think, and I'll need to check the words, but it was something like, I just want Christina's family to know that there are plenty of people left in this Parliament that will continue to fight the fights, some of those fights that she had around decency and equality and respect for each other as humans. And I went home that night and I was pretty broken, I have to say. And it crystallized in my head. I knew that the next morning was the day I was going to step down from the Conservatives.
So was thinking about Christina and her legacy and the work you'd done together. That maybe...
It was that, but also it was just knowing in my heart of hearts that I had to, you only get one crack at life, right? And politics is gritty and it's tough. It's got its ups and downs, it's got its highs and its lows, and I've experienced all of that, as I'm sure everyone has. But that was a real low point for me, and I knew in my heart of hearts, I need, when I walk out of politics, I need to know that I've done what I thought was right all along the way, even if others disagree with it, even if it annoys folk, if it makes them angry, or that's fine. That's part and parcel of it. But I need to be able to look myself in the mirror and stay true to the values that got me into politics in the first place.
Mhm.
And I saw a party that was heading in a direction of travel on a train I could not be a passenger on.
Are you talking about intolerance, say, towards trans people?
Not just trans people. It's intolerance in general. This idea that, you know, I call it the othering of people in society. You can't. That's not. I didn't get into politics to make people feel worse about themselves. You know, I didn't get into politics to pit one vulnerable group against another.
Yes, you mentioned refugees.
No, whether it's refugees, whether it's people with disability, whether it's people of you know, different minority groups, if it's the LGBT community, and that is the LGBT community as it always was, which the Conservative Party signed up to, and many of my former colleagues signed up to those equality promises, and that we were making progress as a parliament, real cross-party progress as a parliament. That, yeah, you know, we disagreed in some of the ins and outs of it, but as a collective, we all agreed that this is a small, vulnerable group of society that could pull together and make their lives better. Now, bear in mind, I grew up in the 90s when relationships were illegal for me when I was 17, 18 years of age. The age of consent wasn't the same. And many of my friends have been through these battles in the 80s and 90s, and we've come through the other side of it. And I'm very lucky to be on the receiving end of that hard work. And I thought the Conservative Party really had turned the corner from the party of Section 28 and all the nastiness around what happened in those days. And some of it was unforgivable, and I've said that. But they really had turned the corner. But for how long? It didn't last long. The narrative, you know, where does this end? Was my fear. You know, at what point do I no longer feel comfortable as a gay man in the Conservative Party?
So you think of becoming intolerant towards minorities, towards people who are, you know, gay or trans or refugees, people who are not.
All of the above.
The main people in society.
And that's not what I didn't get into politics for that. You know, I've got communities in the west coast of Scotland where we have the highest drug and alcohol death rates. We're losing companies and businesses left, right, and centre. There's unemployment, mental health problems, domestic violence issues, huge economic inactivity. That's what got me into politics.
Yes.
And if I can do something to make people's lives a little bit better as well, great.
Okay. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the Gender Reform Recognition Act, or Gender Reform Recognition Bill, really, you were a supporter. It's not been brought back by the Scottish Government. Would you like to see it brought back?
No, I mean, I thought long and hard about this.
Yes.
I mean, the vote was 3 years ago.
Yes.
I mean, at the time we were asked as a parliament, and you know, two things I always remind folk about is the Conservatives had a free vote on it. Other parties tried to whip it. And I was very grateful for that, actually. And actually, some of the people that I disagreed with on that bill were some of the biggest proponents of why we should have a free vote, because they really felt it was an issue of conscience.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm very grateful to former Conservative colleagues, and I won't name them, but they know who they are, who fought long and hard in the shadow cabinet to ensure it was a free vote.
Yes. Yeah.
And because of that free vote, you can't vote wrongly in a free vote. That's the whole point of a free vote. The same will be true of assisted dying. The same will be true of perhaps votes around reproductive rights or other issues. These are votes of conscience and what you believe, perhaps affected by your religious views or moral views. Therefore, you cannot vote wrongly. But I've been made to feel like I have by the Conservative Party for so long now.
Yes.
Now, the other point I always remind people is, if I wasn't the only one, it's often misquoted in the press, but the other two people are well-respected members of this parliament. Jackson Carlo is a great guy. He's a former leader of the Scottish Conservatives, both interim and full-time, until they kicked him out, unfortunately. And that was a shame. And Dr. Sandesh Gohani, the clue's in his name, Dr. Sandesh, who was and still is their current Shadow Health Secretary, who who is brimming with great ideas on how he wants to reform the NHS, for example. No, but the point being is that, you know, it's very easy to paint this as well. It was just the pro-LGBT, lefty, woke guy in the party that voted for it. That's not true. And I feel a bit sorry for them looking over the chamber today at the narrative that they had to listen to from their front bench, and I wonder how comfortable they are.
Yes. Are you worried about trans rights now in Scotland after the Supreme Court decision? You know, what would you say to somebody who's a trans woman who's been using women's toilets for the last 10 years without any trouble, and is afraid to use a man's toilet, and also maybe afraid to use a women's toilet because they might get criticised by now some women.
Absolutely,
what would you say to
I think it'd be a bit of a scary world. Women? I mean, first of all, I, on the record, I accept the ruling of the Supreme Court. I believe in the rule of law. I believe in the separation of powers between the judiciary, parliament and government, and the executive. These are important divisions and things that we may not always agree with decisions from either of them, but we do have to respect them. I don't agree with the SNP government, but they're in power, and that's whether I like it or not. And the same be true of our courts. We have to. I would never ever undermine that, and I also would condemn behaviour that seeks to undermine the independence of the judiciary. And I think that's really important. I was the Shadow Justice Secretary for 2 years, and I really feel strongly about that. And that's on the record. So we have to live with the consequences of those decisions. What is really clear, though, is that, and I said this the other day in the statement, is we do often have to remind ourselves that at the end of the day, these decisions affect people, and that's people in all senses. It's women who were afraid of what they thought was the protection of single-sex spaces, who had very valid fears and views on it, that I think in some cases were shut down and shouldn't have not have been. That's not how you take people with you on these journeys of equality. I know that because of my 20 years of trying to improve, the rights of gay people, for example. It's not something that happens overnight. However, there are also trans people out there who have held, for example, gender recognition certificates for nearly 2 decades. Scotland actually was quite progressive in its legislation in that respect. Doing it way before many other Western countries. We accepted the notion of gender recognition and changing gender 20 years ago in Scotland. But there are people who had been living their lives in that way before the certificates came in, way before the law caught up. So you're talking about people who have been 20, 30, maybe even 40 years living in their acquired gender, are now looking at the headlines and the fact that all politicians and all the media want to talk about is where they go to pee. Of course, they're afraid.
Yes.
Why wouldn't you be? But let's stop talking about people and start talking to them. I challenge people. If you want to really know what a trans person thinks about the current narrative, go and ask them.
Yes.
Go and talk to them. Let's listen to their fears and their concerns and worries and see what we can do, whatever your sides of the view of the gender debate, to make them feel reassured that they're still a valued part of society and that they still have the absolute right to decency, respect, and they can go about their lives. But there's so many unanswered questions now. And that's why I'm really pushing on both of Scotland's governments. The Scottish government and the UK government really have to knock their heads together and produce some much needed guidance for public sector bodies, for public spaces, for private businesses. All these people will have questions about what's right and what's wrong. In my heart of hearts, I feel that most people just want to get this right. I don't think anyone's trying to be exclusionary or discriminatory in any way. I think most people want to do the right thing for everyone, but they don't know what the right thing is. And I think that's something we do need to put to bed. I think we do need to answer those questions for the sake of those organisations, those public bodies, but also the people involved. And that does include the trans community.
Yes.
We do have many questions.
And in terms of, I think we haven't really got much more time, but in terms of maybe the future, presumably you want to stand for the Lib Dems come the next Holyrood election?
I don't know yet. It's like everything. It's been lots happened in the last couple of weeks. And I've heard a lot of nonsense and read a lot of nonsense online about, sort of being parachuted in. One thing I will say, the Liberal Democrats is a member-led organisation. The clue's in the name. It's very democratic. Unlike other parties, the leader doesn't have as much power as he maybe thinks he does. So
it'll be up to local members.
Yeah, absolutely. They pick their candidates. They have the processes. They will choose who they want on their lists and what position and who they want to represent them. And if you want their votes, you have to go and fight for it. Literally knock on every door of every member and say, please vote for me. They ain't going to change the rules for me or anybody else. That's for sure. So I've got to do a bit of thinking. Yes. I've loved my 10 years in politics, and I will walk away from it a much happier person than I would have been on my other trajectory. If I had a career, 20-year career before politics, I'm sure I'd have a 20-year career after it. But politics is a bit of a bug as well. It gets in your system. You get really into it. You get really passionate about it. And I do love it. It's such a privilege.
You want to, if you're, get selected.
Well, I think I've still got the weekend to think about it.
Right. And
I'll consult with what my dog thinks, and I'll get back to you on Monday.
and little bit about how did Lib Dems approach you, or did you approach them? How did that sort of
No,
all
I mean,
happen, really?
you know, I spoke to Alex and said, you know, I think he'd known I hadn't been happy for some time. You know,
Is this before you left as Conservatives?
And we'd been friends for a while. You know, you get to know people, and you have sort of shared values and opinions in the world. So that was quite easy anyway. And actually, the Lib Dem bunch in Holyrood I think all my former colleagues get on with them anyway. They're a really great bunch of folk. But it's a small team. It's a very different vibe, a very different environment. But it's, you know, what's really interesting is political parties that are on the way up. Bear in mind, the Lib Dems did extremely well at the general election last year. Parties, and it reminds me back to 2015, you know, parties on the way up have a completely different vibe to ones that are staring down the barrel of losing half their members at the next election. You know, it's a much happier ship. There's so much positivity and upbeat and just general happiness.
So
you know?
when you left,
when
you left the Conservatives, did Alex Cole-Hamilton say you're going to vote for?
I don't think he was expecting me to say. I said,
did you approach them first?
I looked at every option, and there were different options available to me. You know, you could easily sit as an independent in this place for a year and crack on with your business. There are many pluses to being part of a political party in terms of how you're supported and how you operate. But equally, you have to put your heart into it as well. You know, I didn't go into this lightly. You know, I have to be part of that Lib Dem machine now and engage with members and listen to their views and be part of that policy making decision and the manifesto production. And I will play my part in that. I'm going to bring all the great ideas I had previously. They're coming with me, and it's up to the party to decide which of those ideas they like.
Did any other party approach you after you left the Conservatives?
No.
And I mean, you haven't got a position as, you know, a spokesperson role yet.
Not yet, but hopefully some news on that. We're having a chat. I mean, there's a small group of people, four MSPs covering all portfolios and all committees. It's only natural that I'll have to take, you know, shoulder my responsibilities as well. But I want to help them do that. As I said, you know, I come at this with a pack of ideas and areas of interest. You know, you'll see from the things I've talked about in the last couple of months will be the same things I'll be talking about in the next couple of months. You know, I'm still interested in ferries and our drug and alcohol problem and economic rejuvenation, working class communities and how we support them. That hasn't changed. I haven't changed. I just have a different rosette on now.
Just a little bit about the Conservatives. Are they a deeply unhappy group at the moment?
You'd have to ask them. But, you know, we all have eyes and ears.
When you were there, did they seem a deeply unhappy? I mean, it was only less than a month ago.
There's some really, really lovely people in that group, and I want to remain friends with them. But they will be looking at the polls like everybody else and wondering what on earth is happening to their party. I mean, I made that appeal before the Easter recess. I make the same appeal now. You know, people have to think in their heart of hearts if they're happy with how the party is treating them. I wasn't. If they're happy with the direction of travel and the narrative of the party and their policies and their language in the chamber and in the media, if you're not happy with it, don't put up with it. You don't have to. Your politics is a journey. Your personal politics, your political parties are always evolving. You have to be comfortable and happy where you are. And I say that to folk, you know, you walk out of politics with your head held high. I will, and I hope others can do the same. But that may mean making some tough, difficult personal decisions, as I've done. If others want to do that, I will support them in that.
That was Jamie Greene, the Lib Dem's newest MSP, speaking to Kathleen there. Right, well, that's it for this week on Unspun Live. We've got a busy few old weeks coming up ahead of us. The First Minister has his programme for government next week. Then we've got the vote on assisted dying, the stage 1 vote on assisted dying coming up a little bit after that. And of course, we have the by-election in Hamilton, a pivotal by-election on June the 5th. So make sure you subscribe to Unspun Live wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you again.